So, hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to Becker Medical Library. I am Elizabeth Brander, I'm head of rare books and the Center for the History of Medicine here at Becker. And we are very, very excited about today's day event. So in case any of you are unfamiliar with Becker Library, one of our most prominent rare book collections here is actually the Becker Collection of Ophthalmology and Optics, which is considered one of the most comprehensive collections of historical texts on ophthalmology, focusing on Europe and North American history. And one of our long-term collection goals is actually to expand the scope of those holdings to include materials that speak more broadly to our entire medical school community here at WashU. So it is very fitting that today's event is focusing on the history of ophthalmology in East Asia, specifically Japan. And our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Wayne Tan, who is joining us from Hope College in Michigan, where he is an associate professor of history. He earned his PhD from Harvard University, where he studied under Shigehisa Kuriyama, and he was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College. His research and publications cover historical topics about Japan and East Asia from the early modern period to the present, and he is particularly interested in using disability as a means of understanding social and material aspects of life. His first monograph, titled Blind in Early Modern Japan, Disability, Medicine, and Identity, was received with acclaim by the academic community, and it won several awards, including the American Historical Association's Patricia Buckley Every Prize, which goes to publications in East Asian history prior to 1800. So the talk will be about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for questions afterwards. So please just keep your hands down until the end. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Tan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Is this voice good? Can you all hear me in the back? Great, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth and the staff for involved in hosting and planning this event. And thank you for giving me time and space on the schedule to talk about my work. I appreciate your time, interest, and attendance, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, comments, and questions at the end of the presentation. Let me start with a self-introduction. I'm an associate professor of history at Hope College. I teach disability history, disability studies, the history of medicine, Japanese and Korean history, and world history. And I think it's important for me to say this before I go on with the presentation. I identify myself as a sighted person, but I depend a lot on corrective lenses for my vision. I built my identity around sight, but also embrace the accommodations for my vision. Today, I hope to talk about some ideas from my book, Blind in Early Modern Japan, Disability, Medicine, and Identity. This book was published in September 2022. So in the human life timeline, the book is now a toddler. Really interesting conversations from what this book means to me, and what others have found surprising for their own research. One quick note here, and this is something that I emphasize in my book. Throughout the presentation, I will use, as far as possible, disability first language to foreground blindness in the sources. And I know that people have different thoughts about disability first language or person first language. But I just want to be able to foreground blindness in the lives of blind people and stay close to the sources. And for accessibility reasons, I will keep the original Chinese and Japanese references to a minimum. And as far as possible, I'll use English translations and terms, including the word disability. Now, I don't mean to suggest that English words map exactly onto the original words, but instead I hope to suggest that even where equivalence between languages can be found, it is still possible to find similar words from interpretations of things. Let me start off by asking this question. So as disability historians, disability studies scholars, and also as historians of medicine, what questions do we want to ask? We all have different backgrounds and probably understand disability quite differently. For those of us who work in disability history, disability studies, and history of medicine, I think it is important to come together and think about questions that we can ask across research and linguistic boundaries. There are, I think, some ideas about what disability is or disability should be. Ideas also about how disability studies as a field tends to be too theoretical for most audiences, or so focused on the present or on activism as to miss the realities of disability in the distant historical past. But I think that there's a lot of new and wonderful scholarship that proves otherwise, using theoretical, archival sources and perspectives to show how disability history and disability studies can be a new lens on how we reimagine human experiences. So in my case, a disability history of blindness is in many ways a reorientation of our perspectives to focus on disability, medicine, and identity in early modern Japan. To be a little bit more technical here, we use disability as an intersectional analysis of patterns of thought and behaviors. Now, I do want to say that this focus is selective in that the examples are snapshots of early modern Japan. But I hope that this study will be a step towards a comparative global analysis of disability when we compare Japan to other societies in the same time period. So let me start off with some thoughts about this book. So why this book? So there are three goals in writing this book. So I think the first is to reconstruct the context of disability of a society, essentially how society represents itself and disability in its sources. The next goes to restore a semblance of life, especially around social norms, institutional authority, life with and without privileges, or advantages. And this is a question about how we use sources to find disability. The third, and I think the most important one, is to reposition our narrative viewpoint. So what does it mean to be blind in early modern Japan? So how do we use that to rethink disability? And so this is a question that kind of threads through my book. So in terms of questions, what kinds of questions do we ask? So this is a sample of some questions that I asked throughout the book. So what happens when we look beyond and think beyond professional medicine into the lives of everyday people? And how do we think of or try to think of blind people as people dealing with their disabilities and their various circumstances? In short, this is a book about questions and how I trace my way through the sources and often get lost in the trail, and how I kind of find my way back and venture into unexpected new inquiries. So in summary, I do want to kind of talk about some things that I think are important before I talk more about the content of this talk. Medical perspectives aren't everything, but we do need them in an inclusive approach. And not having a standard word for blind people doesn't mean that blind identity or disability didn't exist at that time. And blind people sometimes chose to include blindness in their identities. References to blind people are both explicit and implicit, and it takes some evidence-based imagination or reimagination to read between the lines and figure out the identities and thoughts and behaviors of blind people. So essentially, my argument is that blindness was a disability in early modern Japan. But this would be too simplistic an answer to satisfy, I think, our inquiries into blindness. The answer is very complicated because I argue that we can't reduce disability to just one meaning, but we have many meanings depending on contents. So disability was an impairment, it was a disablement, and also a form of enablement for blind people. And I'll go into more detail when I talk about specific aspects of the lives of blind people. Let me do a brief introduction of early modern Japan. So maybe a lot of you here have watched, binge watched Shogun. I have, but it's wonderful. So early modern Japan was founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, and there is discussion about the start date of the Tokugawa Shogun. The traditional account would put it at 1600. Some would say it was 1603. But generally, the early modern period lasted from 1600 through about 1868. And so this map that you see here shows the city of Edo, which is Tokyo today. It was the capital of the Tokugawa shogunate. And so if I could just step up frame here, this would be the Edo castle where the shogun lived. This map that you see here shows the different domains or political realms that were governed by daimyos or samurai lords who reported to the shogun. We see up to more than 200 domains across Japan. And each domain had a certain level of autonomy. So samurai lords had autonomy to rule their own affairs. And that was important because it kept the shogun out of a lot of the day-to-day administration. And a lot of the shogunate focused on really important central issues, foreign diplomacy, and so on and so forth. This image here shows the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. It's called the Black Ship. It's like the color and the size of it. The opening of Japan coincided with or was catalyzed by the arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853. That led to the signing of unequal treaties to open ports in Japan. And shortly thereafter, a civil war broke out, and that led to the end of the Tokugawa regime. The rise of the Meiji regime, the Meiji government in 1868, was a major event in Japanese history. It precipitated the transformation in Japan through new technologies from Europe and the US. So for the sake of brevity, I will focus on Japan, but I'll be happy to answer questions about the Meiji period and thereafter. So let me ask this basic question. What is blindness, or what was blindness in early modern Japan? And I think that the word blindness has many meanings depending on who you ask. For a person with visual impairment, blindness may mean one thing. Blindness isn't the direct opposite of sight. Blindness is a form of sight, but it is at the further end of the spectrum of sight. Let me just show you this image. This scene would have been familiar to many people living in Edo. It is a scene of Nihon Bashi, literally the bridge of Japan. And this was the first of 53 stations in a woodblock print series depicting the route from Edo to Kyoto, the imperial capital. This is something I like to ask my audiences. How would you describe this image and the images that follow? This is the same image, but it shows different kind of resolution. It is a blurred image. The colors, I think, are still visible. The boundaries are fuzzy, and you get less clarity, and certainly it seems like a lower resolution image compared to the previous image. And what about this image? So here the colors don't show up as well. I mean, the colors are subdued. It looks as if the right frame is filtered through a translucent or white lens. So two frames right here. This one looks like it's filtered through a white lens. This one has, it's almost a grayscale picture. The colors are always subdued. So what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is that we have to speculate a little bit. Our sources certainly don't tell us how blind the person was. What a blind person could see with visual impairment. Where descriptions of visual impairment, poor vision, and vision loss appear in the archives, we can only imagine what it felt like to be blind. And there was a variety of conditions that would have made up blindness in one or both eyes. So we find a lot of sources, references to a blind person who was actually blind in one eye, but could still see in the other eye. So my working definition of blindness considers the range of possibilities. In short, there was no one way to be blind here in Japan. Let me show you a different image right here. So let's take a different view of Edo. Here on the far right, we have the same bridge. Let me just step out the frame. So we have Nihonbashi right here at the far right. And this is a scene of everyday life in Edo. We have shops on both sides of the main thoroughfare. It could be sometime in the morning when the shopkeepers are setting up shop. We have people talking to each other. A couple of people here calling a wagon of things. And there's a confectionery shop that's selling candy. So there's a lot going on in this image. But unless we know the social context, I think it may be hard to figure out that there's a blind person in this image. So let me draw your attention to this person. So let me step out of the frame again. So this person's head is shaven. He looks like a man. He's walking with his staff. He's carrying something on his back that has the shape of a hair. So we can guess that this is very likely a musical instrument called the biwa, which is a parachute flute. He's walking with his eyes closed, but it's hard to tell if he's blinded based on the visual information. A lot of times it's drawn in lines. I think we say with a level of certainty that this was a blind person because his instrument was associated with the genre of music called the Tale of the Heike music, a medieval epic about the Heike clan in medieval Japan. And this was a profession, this musical profession was associated with blind male musicians from the medieval period through the early modern period. But by the time we get into the early modern period, this genre had become less popular because blind people had found more lucrative professions. So we can also speculate that this blind person, had no choice but to get into this profession, or perhaps he joined this profession because he had connections to people who would teach him this genre. So in a way, one trying to say is that we have to think of the context of people's choices, especially blind people's choices in early modern Japan. Now, let me also show you this image. It is a woodblock print by Katsushika Hokusai. Blindness was a condition that animated the imagination of sighted people, such as artists, of what blind people look like or how they would be depicted. So here we see profiles of blind people as imagined and illustrated by Katsushika Hokusai. Let me just set up the frame again and talk a little bit more about these images. They're primarily faces of older people. We see men and women on both sides. And the physical features show a certain degree of physical deformity. We have, for example, what appears to be wrinkles around this person's left eye. We also have this person right here with eyes shut. And then we have here this woman who has one eye open and one eye shut. And this person here appears to have a scar, but it's a left eye. So there are different representations of blind people by sighted people. So let me kind of venture into this subject of medicine. What were some medical ideas about blindness, about the causes and about the cures? How was medical knowledge organized, and in terms of the history of medicine or the social history of medicine? And how did people understand blindness? What were some cures? Now, when I ask the question about cures, I think it is less about whether those cures actually work, but more about what they tell us about the mindset, what people thought about cures. So this is a kind of a perspective on popular medical culture and consumer culture. So some of you here are medical scholars, medical students, so you may find this interesting. This image shows the 5 spheres of the eyes. The eyes are outlined with clean 2-dimensional contours, and there's no visual sense of volume. But in the spaces inside the eyes and around them, we find that there are markings, and these eyes are divided into what we would call spheres. So let me just step out of the frame again to talk a little bit about the markings. So we have the 2 eyes right here, the left eye and the right eye, and there are markings in these spaces inside and around the eyes. So we have the blood sphere, which corresponds with the heart. The wind sphere, which corresponds with the liver, the water sphere with the kidneys, breath sphere with the lungs, and the flesh sphere with the stomach and spleen. Um, this was one model of human anatomy in Sino-Japanese medical thought. Sino-Japanese is what traditional Japanese medicine is called even today due to the underlying Chinese medical thought. The idea here is that health is a balance of forces, a balance of relationships between the eyes and the rest of the body. For example, when the heart is affected by a disorder or disease, the signs show up in the blood sphere, the counterpart in the eyes. And disorder in the flow of qi in Chinese, or qi, life force in Sino-Japanese and Chinese medical thought, was thought to affect vision, particularly in liver illnesses, because the eyes were thought to gain vision through blood flow from the liver. The cause of blindness could be found in the eyes, or it could be traced to the liver or other failing organs. And the words for disability revolve around ideas of illness and disease, and in the medical sense, the meanings of blindness implicated other body parts and the unique logic of blood and qi flow. What's important here, I think, is that early modern Japanese wrote and talked about disability with a greater degree of subjectivity before the modern era of visual testing aids and standardized visible strength or eye testing. Smallpox was one of those diseases with consequences for vision, and it is one of the diseases that I write about in the book. It was believed that a disease like smallpox had disease poison, so that's kind of a way of framing the how lethal smallpox was. And disease poison could travel around the body. The eyes were linked to the liver, and if the disease poison traveled to the liver, it could travel to the eyes and destroy a person's vision. So we see a sense of connections around the body and how something like a disease poison could travel and affect vision. Let me show you an image from a later moment in Japanese medical history. So this one it features a different model of anatomy. It comes from a new treatise on human anatomy published in 1774 by Sugita Genpaku and several peers in its network. So the name is right there, Sugita Genpaku, spelled Sugita Genpak. I'll refer to it as Genpaku in this presentation. Now, Genpaku's vision of anatomy, as seen here, is completely unrecognizable from the traditional Sino-Japanese perspective. The eyes are enveloped by tissue, they have volume, they appear realistic, perhaps more artistically and anatomically realistic to us than the representations in the previous image. Now, as can be imagined, human dissection opened up new possibilities for someone like Genpaku for further study, and also opened the way for a new paradigm of knowledge. I'll say a little bit more about this on this note. Let me just step out of the frame again. This image here shows a person's head, the face, the two eyes, and this is kind of a front view of one eye. And this one shows the eyeball warp. With all the tissue lesions being out of it. And it shows different perspectives of the orb, the spherical orb. It is certainly more realistic and certainly closer to what we've seen in what we're familiar with than the previous image. So what was the context of Genpaku's discovery or rediscovery of human anatomy? We have to take a detour back to the early years of the early modern Japanese diplomacy. In the 1630s, the Japanese shogunate clamped down on the activities of Europeans in Japan, fearing that Christian Europeans and Japanese Christian converts could conspire to bring down the government. And as a result of the crackdown among the Europeans, only the Dutch, specifically the Dutch of the East India Company or the VOC, were allowed to conduct foreign relations with Japan. They were restricted to an island outpost and placed under close surveillance outside of the port city of Nagasaki. Now, for the shogunate, the Dutch merchants and scholars opened a new window onto the wider world outside of Japan. Sources from Europe arrived at Nagasaki. They were scrutinized for Christian content, and those sources that passed inspection were then allowed into Japan. From early on in Dutch-Japanese relations, Japanese scholars were curious about European languages, Dutch in particular, and European science and technology. In fact, in the late 1600s, a branch of surgical learning traced to the Dutch and Europeans came to be called the red-haired lineage, named after the visual appearance or impression of Europeans' red or reddish hair. In the 1700s, the intellectual climate in Japan eased, with more books on European knowledge and more interest in examining them. Genpaku, whom I introduced earlier, was a scholar of Dutch studies, as studies of European knowledge were called back then. And in particular, Genpaku was interested in Dutch-style medicine, a field of medical learning derived from Dutch studies. So let me talk a little bit about this moment when Genpaku, as he describes, witnessed a human dissection. In his text, The Dawn of Dutch Studies, Genpaku recalled getting news on March 3rd, 1771, of the dissection of an executed criminal to be conducted the next day. He was, of course, not the first person to witness a human dissection, but prior to his time, dissection was not a standard medical or clinical practice. Now, what he saw at the dissection, as he writes, was stunning. So let me read off a quote from his book. It's on this slide. We found that the body parts and structures, were nothing like those described in the old books, but were exactly as represented in the Dutch book. And this book was on the Kundige Tafelen, or Analytical Table of Anatomy by Johann Klimas. And we, with his peers, were completely amazed. We now know that the illustrations by Genpaku in his treatise on anatomy were more based on the illustrations in the source book and less on the actual observations from that day. I mean, we also know that although Genpaku's treatise stimulated new approaches to human anatomy within this new Dutch-style medical framework, the Sino-Japanese medical paradigm remained dominant throughout the rest of the early modern period. But of course, we see occasional glimpses of new Dutch-style medical insights. So here's an image from a Dutch-style medical text from 1831 on optics, and I think it's available here in the library. I just saw it. It is a model of human anatomy that describes optics. And certainly this would have been closer to Genpaku's model than to traditional Sino-Japanese models. And I think this image hints at how this belief might have been understood in light of new theories of vision by those Dutch-style medical scholars. Now, this image shows what happens in far-sighted vision. So let me just step out the frame again. So this is kind of where normal vision, quote-unquote normal vision happens in the light rays converge right here. But then when for far-sighted vision, the light ray converge beyond this point. And so this text kind of describes what far-sighted vision is and how to correct this vision. This text, of course, doesn't quite tell us what disability was, but we can imagine that vision loss or poor vision due to farsightedness would have been described as a disability if it was significant enough to impair a person's vision. Let me show you one more image here. Now, this one comes out of a different context. So this is a popular medical print on measles. At the center, we see two people in conversation with each other, a woman talking to a man. Now, this is an example of a medical print with advice on how to cope with illnesses. So to understand the significance of it, I think we have to think about the popular medical context. So this print was written in a vernacular style, in a more colloquial style that would have been easier to read than a professional kind of medical treatise. Measles is notoriously contagious, as we know it. And at that time, it was feared as by many for causing blindness. And in my book, I talk about some of the profiles of some people who were blinded or who became blind due to measles. the dietary regimen would have been understood in that light in terms of how certain foods could interact with quote unquote disease poison, the poison of diseases, especially the disease poison of measles if it wasn't fully eliminated from the body. So we have here advice on foods to eat, for example, daikon, radish, pickles, and kelp would help with the recovery. Foods to avoid, foods that were thought to interact with the disease poison, like burdock root, spinach, eggplant, would have triggered this disease poison and caused disease. This is also a really interesting trait. This one personifies diseases and medicines as army. It was produced sometime after the early modern period. But I think it is important because we see the representations of some of the iconic medicines from the early modern period. So let me just point out some medicines to you. I'll step out the frame again. So here we have, so A here would be the soul returning pill, which was one of the famous medicines curing some ailment. And here we have the 10,000 gold pill, the prohibited pouch pill here. This one is the life-saving pill. This one right here is the black pill, thought to be really effective for some ailments. And then right here we have bear's gallbladder, which was one of the ingredients in many medical recipes. So, what we see here is a composite geography, an iconography, so to speak, featuring common household medicines. These medicines actually work on visual impairment. We don't know, but instead, I think we should appreciate how these choices, these medicines represent popular choices and are objects in the cultural system of cures, the beliefs of cures that rationalize those choices. In other words, when we leave out the history of cure, we miss out on this piece of social history. So let me transition to the final part of this presentation to talk more about disabled identity. What was disabled identity and how do we find it in the sources? From early on, I found this quote from literary disability studies scholar Tobin Stevens' work to be very helpful. I have a quote right here, and I'll read it off to all of you. According to Stevens, passing as non-disabled and masquerading as more disabled, in addition to actions and statements of social critique, are practices where disabled people consistently self-identify as disabled, where they use the knowledge of society unique to them. And so this comes from his chapter on returning to the social model of disability. My interpretation of this is along the lines of autonomy and agency of people with disabilities. So this is the quote that I have from my book. So let me just read it off also to all of you. Those blind people in the early modern Japan, as individuals and in organized groups, played a role in scripting and enabling their lives. Individually and collectively, they reacted to conditions of disability as actors who were conscious and cognizant of their circumstances, employing their disability-based identities to their advantage and also quite often to the detriment of less able peers. What I'm trying to say here is that blind people acted, they had choices, they made their decisions, they used blindness to their advantage, but a lot of blind people also didn't have the same kinds of advantages and the disadvantage in society. I'll talk a little bit about status and identity. So this part is important for understanding the status of blind people. The image widely associated with early modern Japan is probably the image of the samurai. Beneath the class of the samurai, we have the majority of the Japanese population, commoners made up of merchants, artisans, peasants, and townspeople. The traditional scholarship from 20 to 30 years ago would say that early modern Japanese society was structured in a Confucian way with a strict hierarchy. But I think recent research has shown how there was a lot of flexibility in the organization of status. There were multiple identities based on a person's occupations, and local government was organized into status-based rule, which kind of gave domain lords a certain degree of autonomy in organizing the affairs of commoners. So how do we situate blind people in this vibrant context? How do we give back to them their voice and agency in their everyday lives amid the tensions of discrimination against blind people and other forms of social enablement? Let me talk about this very briefly about this guild, the Kyoto Guild of Blind Men. This was founded sometime in the 1200s, if not in the 1300s, in Kyoto as an elite academy to train blind men to become musicians of heike. So the blind musician that you saw in the image of the streets of Edo, that blind person comes from this lineage of blind male musicians who were trained in the tale of the heike. So from the 1600s, the late 1600s, this guild had branches all over Japan. It served as, for lack of a better word, a quote-unquote national institution for blind men. And we find references to guild members all over the sources. Now, this was an exclusively male institution with a strict hierarchy of ranks from the bottom right to the top. And it was an institution that helped blind men with financial needs. It was exploitative, but also an institution that could, at certain times, represent the collective identity of the guild and could also afford certain privileges. This is an image of a blind masseur. So this was taken, I think, in the late 1800s. It comes from the Welcome Images database. It shows a blind masseur. Let me step out and really talk a little bit about him. So let me try to describe him to you. This is a shaven, differentiated shaven. He is walking on cloth, traditional wood cloth. He's walking with a staff. And he has a whistle. He's blowing the whistle with his lips. So back in those days, blind masseurs would blow their whistles to announce their arrival and pay clients to approach them, and the blind masseur would perform his services. This is an interesting account, by someone, a foreigner in Japan in the 1880s. And I'll read off this description of his experience of massage. It is a warm night in Tokyo. I'm very tired, and I've just heard the whistle of a blind shampooer. Shampooers, this was a word for masseurs, on the streets outside my hotel. I've clapped my hands in order to shampoo. He now begins to pass his hands over my body. He first seeks out two spots on my shoulders, and into these his thumbs go. It seems to me almost to the joints. The place he touches are obviously nerve centers, whereas he gulges them, my whole frame quivers. It's a very descriptive account, and we find other accounts of blind masseurs as foreigners encounter them in Japan. This is the final part of the presentation on status and identity. I talked a lot about blind men, so some of you may be thinking, what about blind women? And I think this is an important part of the story about disability and gender. Blind men and women face discrimination. They had to work in niche professions. There were ideas about blindness. They couldn't find jobs easily. A blind person could have tried to pass as a sighted person to get into lucrative professions. In other words, a blind person with sufficient sight could have tried to get into a profession that was not one of the niche professions. Now, this was never an easy choice, whether, how, or when to embrace blind, disabled identity, because a person's choice had consequences on their livelihoods and connections. The Kyoto Guild of Blind Men represented blind men, but there was no equivalent national institution for blind women. In other words, blind women didn't have the same level of representation as blind men. So blind women had fewer options, and if they were, they often found acceptance as musicians. I'll just draw your attention to this person I found in the sources. Her name is Sugimoto Hikoe. Hikoe is her first name, Sugimoto the family name. Now, there are accounts of blind female musicians, and now this comes from after the early modern period. But I think it's useful because when we look at the profiles of blind female musicians in the late 1800s, many of them, in fact, had connections to the early modern period, either because their mentors, their teachers lived through the late the 50s and the 60s of the early modern period, or they themselves were old enough to have lived through some part of the early modern period. Kikwe contracted measles at age 5. She was misdiagnosed. She was given different medications. She eventually lost her sight. Her mother took her to different physicians, and in this oral history provided by Kikwe, we know that she faced a lot of hardship, emotional turmoil as she went from one doctor to another and wasn't cured. And her parents, in fact, suffered as well because they really wanted her to be cured. At age 7, sensing that, realizing rather that there was no other choice for her, her parents sent her to be adopted by a musician, a senior musician, Goze, Goze, that is a reference to blind female musicians. The family assumed that music was the only suitable profession for blind girls. And so within a month of adoption, Kikwe started traveling with the group. She was trained in lyrical genres by 2 senior women, Mase and Katsu, who were blind female musicians. And there was a rite of passage at the age of 13. She was given a professional name and she was promoted. So after about 7 years of training. And then age 16, she earned the right to accept disciples, but didn't quite become, quote unquote, a mother, senior matriarch, until after Katsu passed away. And even in her 20s, according to Kikwe, she was still trying to find a cure. She talked about going to see an ophthalmologist when she was in her 20s, hoping in Saigon Prefecture, hoping that there would be a cure for her blindness. She wasn't sure, and I think that was the last straw for her. She kind of reconciled with her blindness. So how blind is Kikwe? So this is perhaps one of the few descriptions that we have from this period, from the late 1800s, early 1900s, of a person's blindness. According to Kikwe, when it was pitch dark at night, she couldn't see anything and was fearful of walking. On moonlit nights, she could still feel blind sensation on her eyelids. In the day, she could still make out dim or faint shadows of the sighted guide in front of her. But by the age of 50, she lost all sensations of light and shadow. So this is perhaps one of the most, fulfilling descriptions that we have of a person's account of their blindness. So let me conclude. This is the final slide. Where does all of this lead to? So here's some concluding and I want to say follow-up thoughts. How do we talk about disability before disability? The disability that we talk about today comes out of the 20th and the 21st centuries. So how do we capture descriptions of disabilities in pre-modern periods or pre-1900 periods in different societies? And I think disability history and disability studies provide a new lens on the history of medicine. Instead of talking only about blindness from medical perspective, from the perspective of causes and cures, I think there are other ways of thinking and talking about the social lives of people with blindness. What are the constituents of disability culture and how is disability culture formed? Now, I'll end with this final thought. So I gave a presentation at an online critical blindness studies conference in 2022. And this phrase has stuck with me ever since that conference. One of the presenters talked about blindness as a form of gain, blindness as a way, as an insight into a different world, into a different experience. So we think about blindness as gain, then how do we think about blindness and disability as a new source or new sources of identity? So thank you very much for your time. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Yes. You mentioned one story of someone that was blind from childhood, and then I think there were less very narrative descriptions of the people that were blind later on in life. I was just curious. It's a little different to contract blindness when you're 50 years old or 40 years old and then have to learn a new profession or something like that. Whereas if you're 5, your family can maybe send you to like the musicians or whatnot and have you learn that profession. What was was there any difference in the treatment of people based on when they contracted blindness or what their role in society was? If they were born blind versus they got it from an illness versus they got it later on in life?
Great, I think that's a really important question. The age of the onset of blindness, I think, matters. And I think a lot of the examples about blind men who joined the guild, these were people who became blind in childhood, or at least were blind before the age of 14. There was no requirement, no age requirement to join the Kyoto Guild, but some places specify 14 as the maximum, the cutoff age for someone to be a member. And so we tend to find that younger people who became blind were able to kind of repurpose themselves, for lack of a better word, to retool themselves and learn professional skills and be engaged in niche professions. Now, you raise a really interesting point about, what happens to people who became blind later in life. We don't know as much about them, but I have found examples of how older people who became blind were supposed to be cared for at home. There were more realistic tales of how a person could bring out the best in their family by caring for an aged and blind parent or blind relative in the family. And I think the chances are that a person who became blind later in life probably had less opportunities just because of the way the guild was set up. Now, if we're talking about a blind woman, I think the opportunities were even more limited. Because they were expected to perform certain roles in the household. Marriage was something that would have been very difficult for a blind woman. And so this also raises the question of deafness. So deafness is not something that I talk about or write about in this book, but I think this question that you raised about being blind at birth and compared to being blind later on in life, I think that also we see parallels with deafness. Prelingually deaf, person deaf before the acquisition of language, and postlingually deaf after the acquisition of language. What's really interesting is that I haven't found many examples of people described to be blind at birth. In fact, the profiles that I have of blind people were people who became blind between the ages of 3 and I would say 7, which was probably a time in the childhood years when measles and smallpox were prevalent. So there were different epidemics of smallpox and measles. So I kind of want to say that many of these blind people that I found that I featured became blind because of smallpox or measles or other contagious diseases. Thank you.
Yes, those pills that you described by color primarily, can you tell us what was in them?
Yeah, right. So that's great. That's a great question. I can't remember the ingredients off the top of my head, but I know that some pills had licorice. The soul returning pill that I showed that had up to some would say 23 ingredients. And these were quote unquote patented medicines. And so a lot of the recipes were guarded by manufacturers. We have hearsay accounts of what went to making of these pills, but we don't know for sure. And what's really interesting also is that as these patented medicines were in circulation, there were reports also of counterfeit medications, so fake medications that were being circulated. And so different domains had different laws to punish people who make fake medicines. But off the top of my head, I want to say that some ingredients were licorice, a gallbladder certainly was one of them, and also ground roots, roots of plants. So I wish I had more specific ingredients, but off the top of my head, these are the 3 that I can think of.
Thank you. I was going to make a comment and then ask a question. So the little girl with the measles, it said that she had searched around, she was misdiagnosed. I really don't think they could have done much for her,
Right.
despite if she had been accurately diagnosed, especially in the late 1800s. And they also, you had mentioned measles and smallpox. And the onset between 3 and 7, could you comment on other causes of blindness from in the whole age spectrum, and being glaucoma and this. So.
Yeah, great. So thanks for the comment. Thanks for the question. So let me start with the comment. So her family, Kiwi's family, probably couldn't have done much, but I think the effort to find a cure speaks to this system of beliefs. One of the places that they went to was a temple in their neighborhood that claimed to have proprietary medicines for blindness. It was famed, so to speak, for medications that would cure blindness. That was one of the places they went to. When we look through the sources from the early modern period, we find stories, accounts of temples, places of healing, miraculous healing. People went to them, travel guides featured them. And I think, these sources tell us a lot about what people thought about cures and how they believed, in cures, even if they knew that they wouldn't be cured in the end. And so regarding the next point about diseases that cause blindness, one of the diseases that I've been able to kind of reconstruct based on the evidence is trachoma. Trachoma is kind of an infectious eye disease that causes the scarring of the cornea. Of course, when we're looking at historical texts, we reconstruct a disease based on the evidence and compare the profiles to what we know about those diseases today. I mean, it's imperfect, but what I want to say is that some of the symptoms that I found in these descriptions match symptoms of trachoma. And I've also found symptoms that match what we would know as glaucoma today. Sexually transmitted diseases too, syphilis, gonorrhea. We find descriptions of how babies could become blind if a mother contracted these diseases. And we also have evidence of what, for lack of a better diagnosis, would count as red eyes. A very general description of eyes becoming red and a person becoming blind after. So it could be, I don't know, conjunctivitis or something else. So these are some of the diseases that I've been able to reconstruct based on the textual evidence.
Tuberculosis too.
Yeah, tuberculosis. So I don't find references to blindness caused by tuberculosis, but we do know that tuberculosis causes all kinds of symptoms, deformities in the spine, for example, and other things. But tuberculosis didn't quite have the same prominence as the smallpox or measles. Sure.
Two questions for you. First, can you talk a little bit about the connection between the blind men and the shaven heads?
Yeah.
Because every time I think of a blind man in early modern Japanese visual culture, he's got a shave.
Yeah.
And second, is there any discussion of sources of use of corrective or dark lenses by any of these individuals?
Sure. So let me start with the first question. So the blind male musician, maybe I could just so maybe I'll just, this is the one you're referring to, right?
Well, or even the whole side, the next slide.
Yeah. So this person, in the Japanese kind of a name for a person like this performing the Heike story was Biwa Hoshi. So kind of like a priest of Biwa, so to speak. In the medieval period, so we're looking at say the late 1100s and 1200s. These blind male musicians occupied, I wouldn't say a liminal role. We don't quite know the nature of this song, the tale of the Heike. There are theories that suggest that this story was performed to appease the dead souls of the Heike. And so this person, the blind musician, kind of moved between different worlds, the present world and the other world. And so he has that kind of a religious aura about him. And these blind male musicians could also have performed Buddhist genres, which would suggest why this blind male musicians from that era had shaven head because of their associations with spiritual life and Buddhism. And this became a tradition, so that by the time we get to the early modern period, blind male professionals shave their heads as a sign of their status, so to speak. Blind masseurs also adopted the same style for status purposes. And so the next question is about corrective lenses. I think this is a great question. When we talk about corrective lenses, I think we think about prescriptions, right? Prescriptions that would match your degree of visual impairment. I don't want to say that prescriptions only became a thing after the Meiji period. We have visual depictions of people wearing glasses in Edo, but those were more like curiosities. Certainly people put on glasses to help them see better. The refraction to some extent helps with vision. I have an account from a diary of Bakian who became blind in old age, and he writes about wearing corrective lenses, but at some point the lenses don't help because he's just losing his vision. And so we have evidence of people using or wearing corrective lenses, but how they actually use them, I don't know. But they're more like curiosities than actual cures for visual impairment.
Thank you for captivating talk. I have two questions as well.
Sure.
First, about this idea of blindness as enablement. When I was listening to that part of your talk, I was reminded of some examples in Korea where also blind musicians were called into court to train in the Academy of Music, and they were considered to have special powers, not only for music, but also for divination, the ability to see the future, right? Yeah. So I was wondering if you had examples like that, maybe similar from case law in Japan. And the second question about institution, you mentioned this national guild of blind musicians, right? So to what extent was it self-help organization? To what extent did domain lords and shogunate get involved? And if they did get involved, what was in it for them? Was it a performance of rule, benevolent rule?
Great, thank you very much for those questions. So this is one example that I didn't get to address the talk. So we have examples of women as spiritual healers, Nico. I think shaman might be the best translation. Nico's shamans, blind girls became shamans. That was an accepted practice in northeastern Japan. I think the practice dates back to the early modern period. And certainly, I think you brought up the example of Korea. And so I think it speaks to the idea that people who are blind have a certain kind of insight or a certain kind of vision to see things that people couldn't see. And that might explain some of these liminal spiritual roles that they played. I have also examples of blind priests, so blind people in Japan who chanted sutras, for temples, performed divination rites on auspicious occasions for households. There are these examples in Japan. In China, I want to say that blind people perform as musicians too, the blindness as well. In the Western world, I think blind people work as basket weavers. We have photographs of blind people at the Perkins School or piano tuners, basket weavers, and I think a lot of these professions involve tactile functions. Because I think the idea is that people who are blind are thought to be better with other senses, with hearing, for example, which would explain their role in music, with the sense of touch, that would explain massage, basket weaving, and things like that. As to your next question about the role of the guild, it would appear, so the guild would appear to be a self-help organization. It kind of recruited members to be part of the organization, but it was far from it, I would argue, because the guild was all about enriching its revenue, its coffers, enriching itself. Blind men who joined the guild had to pay a fee to join. They had to find a teacher, a mentor. They had to buy ranks, to purchase ranks to climb up the hierarchy. And so that was one way. I mean, for the shogunate, the shogunate knew that was happening, but it was an efficient way from the shogunate's point of view to govern blind people. I mean, they could kind of outsource, so to speak, the autonomy to this blind guild to manage blind people. As to the level of cooperation of the local government, the domain authority, for example, I don't think they objected to people joining or not joining. I think local authorities were also about the efficiency of government. It was about having these blind people to gain skills to be self-sufficient so that they wouldn't rely on charity in their domains. And so I think I found examples of how blind, the local governments would overlook the fact that a blind person didn't join the guild because this person was self-sufficient or could be taken care of by his family. So, in other words, it was a pretty flexible approach. If you had the means, you could join the guild. If you didn't have the means, but if you had family to take care of you, why join the guild? So this person would be taken care of by their families. So there were different options. The guild was certainly one important option, but it was not like, the only option for the self-help organization that it would appear. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. You had your hand up.
Yeah. This is kind of building off of the previous question about corrected lenses,
Sure.
but it sounds like there are very rigid roles in society for people that were blind, and I was curious, having these roles, was there any sort of resistance in when there was technology to help at least treat some cures for blindness? And I think that this is, you talked about like prescription lenses, but like other things that might have helped with their blindness, or like other technologies that could have maybe made certain parts of the world more accessible to them. Was there any tension between them? Because there's very clearly like this desire to lose that part of blindness from at least the person that you mentioned. I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
Kikue.
Yeah.
But then there's like this societal expectation of what you should be if you were blind too.
Right. So that's a good question. I'll try to answer it from two perspectives, from the early on perspective and from the modern perspective, the post 1868 perspective. In terms of technology, I think it's certainly corrected lenses were a means of helping the person see better. But I think a lot of the treatments, so to speak, were primarily ointments, pills, decoctions of medical ingredients. We don't have anything that we would call, that would kind of penetrate the eye, so to speak, to have a better picture of the eye. Things that would be, there were cataract surgeries in the early modern period. There was a lineage of ophthalmologists that specialized in cataract culture, removing cataracts. So I think that would be, I guess, the closest to what we would consider to be a modern technology. But certainly there were other forms of surgery, breast tumor removal. There are recorded instances of that. From the modern post 1868 perspective, I think what was a watershed moment was the abolition of the guild. So the guild was dismantled in 1871. And then, of course, the Meiji government embarked on this rapid modernization. It looked at Russia, Germany, the US, and Britain for examples of ophthalmology. We see resistance also against some of these new technologies. And the Meiji government, for example, denigrated traditional treatments, condemned all these Sino-Japanese traditional cures, remedies, and things like that. But that also kind of brought on a different kind of problem. So much as the guild was an exploitative institution, it still offered a certain level of security for blind members. For example, in the early modern period, a blind person could appeal to the guild for a bigger share of alms than what was given to him from a household. But without that infrastructure, this rapid modernization came at the expense of the social welfare. There was no equivalent, so to speak, social infrastructure to take care of blind people. And while we talk about blind education, schools for blind people, schools for deaf people, I think it's important to remember that only a very small number of people in the Japanese population got to enjoy quote unquote special education. Because the vast majority of people still rely on household medications, for treatment of eye diseases. We have advertisements still throughout the 1800s and 1900s of household medications that would cure visual impairment and all kinds of visual of impairment. So I think that also kind of leads us back to the question of what technology is, what we consider to be technology, whether, and it's hard to say that, I wouldn't want to say that the early modern period was less modern than the modern period, but I think we do have to evaluate the early modern period with a very different framework and with a very different understanding of what technology was. Thank you. Thank you.